spraying our body. Dooby-dooby-doo. 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 I'm your host, Sabrina Salvati. Dooby-dooby-doo.
Hello. Welcome, everyone. Happy Wednesday. I have a special guest with me tonight. His name is Garland Nixon. He is a radio talk show host, a former police officer, a criminal justice adjunct professor, and a political analyst in D.C. Welcome, Garland.
Hey, thanks for inviting me.
Thanks so much for coming on. If you are new, everyone watching, Sabby Sabs podcast is a part of the Revolutionary Blackout Network. You can catch me there on Thursdays for the Roundtable and Friday for the Sabby Show. All right. So, Garland, you have done a lot of things. Like, you have a lot of experience. I've been waiting to talk to you for a while. And before we get into the video about Briahna Joy Gray and Ben Jealous, I have to get your opinion about the Biden administration. Like, how do you think they're doing? Do you think they're doing a good job? Do you think it's the same old? And a little bit about your political ideology.
So I'm a very left-leaning person, way left of the Democratic Party. And my focus, to be quite frank, first and foremost, is anti-war, anti-imperialist. I am particularly concerned with how people of color are treated around the world. You know, there are a lot of people that focus on racism and discrimination in America. And I always put it like this. You know, if you have a person who goes to a bar and gets in a fight, then on the way home, he gets in an argument, with a road rage argument, he gets out the car, he gets in a fight. When he comes home, he's going to beat his wife and children, because you talk about a person with a violent mentality. They've got violence about them. That's who they are. And so the way I see racism as discrimination is the difference between foreign policy and domestic policy is only grammatical. So I think that in order to address the racism at home, you're going to have to deal with the fact and the reality that the United States government is horribly racist around the world, and it has to be addressed either both places or neither. And so I focus on, if you look at what all over the world, because I'm a person who believes in peace, but particularly the Caribbean, South America. I'm starting to learn more about Africa and how people of color are treated around the world by the United States government. And since that is my focus, the obvious answer would be that I think the Biden administration is horrific, is atrocious. I don't think there are words that have been created in the English language, maybe another language, that could express how I feel about the Biden administration. If so, I probably wouldn't want to say them in front of people, because they wouldn't think much of me if they heard me using that kind of language. So that's where I am with the Biden administration.
I hear you. I agree with you 100% on that. So Briahna Joy Gray, this is what we're going to talk about tonight, guys. So Briahna Joy Gray had a discussion. I don't think it really was a debate, because, and you'll see, I'll play clips from the video, but basically, to make a long story short, Ben Jealous brought up defunding the police. And I don't even think that was the topic of the stream, but it came up. And so she had a discussion with Ben Jealous about defunding the police, and it got a little heated. And so I want to talk about that tonight. I'm actually going to go ahead and start at the 3-minute mark, because that's when they start discussing it. So I'm going to play a clip from that. And then, Garland, I want you to chime in and give me your opinion about this discussion.
Sounds good.
Share my screen here. All right. And I'm going to mute my mic so I don't have an echo.
To stop police violence. It terrified me when I saw the slogan defund the police, because I knew they would do what it's done, which is to frankly scare a lot of old Black folks and push them to the right. And so what do we see, right? We see, police endorsed folks taking out our most progressive mayors, right? You get Eric Adams, you don't get Maya Wiley.
Wait a minute. Ben Jealous, do you think that that Eric Adams won and Maya Wiley lost because of defund the police and not because Scott Stringer, who was the left candidate in the lead, was succumbed to a Me Too scandal that ultimately didn't amount to much to anything, but the left immediately turned tail and abandoned him. There was a failure to coalesce around an alternative candidate until the 11th hour. Diane Morales' campaign, who was potentially the other left insurgent, got taken down by her own internal Michigas and on and on and on. Like, I don't know that you can lay blame for Eric Adams' success on the slogan defund the police, especially when none of the candidates ran a defund the police platform, none of them. And all of them had very similar, the plurality of the at least more liberal candidates had a very similar stance on how much they wanted to decrease police funding in New York. They all just said like $1 million. Like, they all said the same thing.
Except, I would say this, you have to look at the posture of the candidates, and you have to look at the impact that it had on pushing people towards more centrist candidates. You can look at the opinion polls right after George Floyd, where there was massive consensus to really move quickly to stop police violence. And then you can look at the impact that defund the police had on pushing people back towards the center and the right.
Ben, that is not my recollection of what happened. My recollection of what happened is that you're correct that after George Floyd's murder went viral, there was a lot of public consensus around sympathy for protests, sympathies for even some property damage style protests, and defund the police as a slogan was polling at around 40%, which was pretty high. Subsequently, Joe Biden pit the idea of protesting and defund against the idea that he would be reelected and be able to beat Trump. And suddenly voters had to choose between solidarity with these protests, which they were told by a 24-hour news cycle on MSNBC and CNN was going to hurt Joe Biden's chances, and getting Trump out of office. And over the course of Joe Biden antagonizing the slogan and Don Lemon and everybody else getting on TV and saying how bad the slogan was, of course, public opinion of the slogan went down.
No, I don't think that Joe Biden drove that at all. When you look at somebody...
Joe Biden, who came out today after the Kyle Rittenhouse verdict and crossed his arms and said, the jury system works in America.
Totally yeah, like severely problematic. Just like it was problematic when Joe Biden. Look, Joe Biden is a blue dog Democrat, and he's gonna be a blue dog Democrat, and his sensibilities are out of touch often with history. He's made two very problematic historical statements on two issues I spent my whole life working on in the last 6 months. One was today about juries, right? And it's like, oh my gosh. Does this man even understand the history of lynchings and everything else in our society? That like juries do a good job or whatever the heck he said. Crazy. The other thing was back in August when he was really buttonholed at a CNN town hall meeting about voter suppression laws and the need for a strong federal response. And he said, literally, you just can't stop the people from voting. So yes, Joe Biden makes problematic statements, but what I'm telling you is a guy who goes to church in the poorest zip code in Baltimore, where my family's gone to church for 85 years, with a whole bunch of little old ladies, is that defund the police, when it hit the pews of that church in Sandtown, Baltimore, right, Harlem Park, Baltimore, they were terribly confused. They were so ready to follow young activists. They also are so afraid of bullets flying to the neighborhood, of home invasions, of carjacking, that you cannot give people half a solution. You've got to give them.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. There's more to this video, but I want to talk about that segment first. So Garland, I want to get you in here. What's your take on this, on what you saw so far? And what is your opinion about defunding the police?
So I'll start by saying this. When I watched that, the problem I had with that was they weren't talking about defunding the police. They weren't talking about the slogan. They weren't talking about whether it's a good or bad slogan. They weren't talking about what it means. They were doing hypothetical discussions about who thought that they could project the results of using the slogan out. Well, I think it caused this person to win. How can you say it caused this person to win? And off they win, spinning off into the, off into the hither and yon about the results of using the slogan without actually discussing the merits of the slogan, what it means, why. If you're opposed to it, I think it's a bad slogan, and I can make a quantitative argument as to why I think it's a bad slogan, what results it has, and who it makes win or doesn't win. I don't know that. I mean, I've seen, as a person who analyzes politics, there are many times that I've seen a race and everybody will look at it and people will say the mayor won because of this. And when you analyze the politics, it had something to do with potholes being fixed or things that you would have never suspected. So we don't know why this person or that person won. And to spin things as I don't let defund the police, therefore this mayoral candidate lost because they used the slogan, I think misses the point. Here's the point. What is the slogan? What does it mean? Is it the best thing to use for what you're trying to accomplish? Right? Those are the kinds of things you have to determine, not whether or not people won because of it. Now, the phrase defund the police. I don't like the phrase. I will be honest with you. I don't like the phrase. Right? And here's one of the reasons. Because you shouldn't be talking about the phrase. Because everybody argues about the phrase. If everybody's arguing about the phrase is problematic. If that's the first indication to me that there's a problem with the phrase, we're trying to accomplish something. We're trying to address the unfair treatment of people of color, right? And we're arguing about the phrase that we use to get there. And we're wasting all this energy on the phrase. If you're wasting all your energy on the phrase, perhaps you should come up with another phrase. The issue that you're trying to accomplish is not the phrase. It's what you're trying to do. So if somebody says, I don't agree with the phrase, but I agree with what you're trying to do. Okay, well, look, if you're on board with what we're trying to do, let's get that happen. Let's make that happen. And we get lost in, hey, do you like the phrase? I don't like the phrase. What's wrong with that guy? I love the phrase. And we spent 12 hours talking about the phrase and accomplished nothing to address racism and discrimination. So I'll tell you why I don't like the phrase. To me, the phrase is not the phrase of traditional Black civil rights activists. It's not the rhetoric. Let me change it this way. The rhetoric of traditional Black civil rights activists, the rhetoric of Black radicals, that's not the phrase of them. What kind of phrase to me is defund the police? Defund the police is the rhetoric of anarchists. Because literally, what does it mean? When it's like a Rorschach blot, put this in front of somebody and what does their brain do, right? Okay, what is their brain? How does it prime their brain? Defund the police is fairly literal. If you can go to a dictionary, it means stop funding the police. That's what that's what the phrase means. The problem I have, I'll put it like this. You know a great phrase? Medicare for all. And I was one of the people who, believe it or not, during I was working with John Conyers' office and Sheila Jackson Lee's office at the time, when I still felt that the Democrats were salvageable in 2009 on the Obamacare, right? And there was a discussion because back then, there was some horrific term we used. It was a technocratic term. I don't even remember. I don't even want to think about what it was back then. It was called whatever it was. And there was a discussion, and eventually it came to Medicare for all, and that's what was settled on, because you don't have to ask any questions. What is it? Medicare. Who gets it? Everybody. It answers all the questions. You don't have to say Medicare for all. What does that mean? It's already done. Here's what always happens. When people say defund the police, the literal meaning is an anarchist rhetoric, and that is defund the police, no more money for the police, which means you don't have police. That's the rhetoric of anarchy. However, the people, the civil rights activists, the Black radical activists are not saying no police. And that's what this implies. What they're saying is we have to take the money that's used for policing, and we have to use that money to do a couple of things. We have to spread it out to address the root causes of crime. And we have to understand that now we have the police responding to social issues, injecting themselves into things where they bring a danger that shouldn't be brought there, right? So it's a broad discussion, and it's a beautiful discussion to have. However, defund the police, the term, the phrase, because it's the phrase of anarchist, it takes people away. And because it's not clearly defined, your enemies and your adversaries will define it for you. Because as soon as you say defund the police, and people say, well, I don't think we shouldn't have any cops at all. I mean, that's a little scary. And then you have to go, no, that's not what we mean. Here's what we mean. And you get into this broad discussion. So in my opinion, the phrase does not reflect the ideology. It does not reflect the intents, and nor the policies behind it. So I think it's an error to use a phrase that doesn't accurately reflect what's behind it. And I would argue this: if you're not going to do the Medicare for all type phrase, if you can't settle on a phrase that's axiomatic, that's self-evident, that as soon as people hear them, it's positive, it's moving forward, this is what we're going to do. Remember, defund the police is, this is what we're going to stop doing. I never believe in that. I believe in your rhetoric should always say, we're going to do this. We're going to act this way. We're going to assertively act. If you don't have a phrase like that, you don't have to have a phrase. It's nice if you have one, and once you come up with one, roll with it. So that's my opinion on the phrase, just clinically saying the rhetoric and the thought process that is aroused by people when you utilize the term defund the police, and it just comes across as a literal. And I think so. That's what I think.
I guess for me, like, I didn't take it that way because, you know, I work in education, and one of the problems that we have in education in this country, especially public education, is that every year certain states they'll defund the schools. They'll pull money and, like, they'll pull resources from the schools, but that doesn't mean we don't have schools. So I guess for me, like, I didn't take it that way, but I do know what you mean. Like, a lot of people I've talked to, they just think, oh, they don't want any kind of law and order, and they just want complete anarchy and be able to do whatever they want to do. And I guess for me, because of my field, and I'm used to seeing schools lose funding. That's essentially what they do. Like, the state governments, when they pull the resources and funding from the schools, they're defunding those schools. But I do get what you're saying. What phrase do you think, like, what should we call it? Because there's so many layers to this. I feel like, yes, it's like you want to, you know, take some of those resources from police, put that money back into Black and brown communities. But how do you package that up into something that's short and sweet?
Well, you know, I don't know. I'm not a PR person. I'm not going to pretend. Here's what I have to say. If until such time as you come up with that phrase, or somebody who's really good at, you know, and creative with words comes up with that phrase, I think you're better off with no phrase than utilizing a phrase that like puts the crosshairs of your adversaries right on you. Because remember, so when you say, I am in favor of all this stuff and I understand it, so when I hear it, it's great. But when you're advertising, what are my adversaries going to do with this phrase? And what are the people that have no idea? I am advocating for something, right? I'm an advocate for something. So when I'm advocating for a cause, I have to think, how do I advocate for this cause to people who know nothing about it? How do I advocate for this cause to people who oppose it? Right? How do I win over the people? You know, how do I preach to the choir? I already got the choir. They're singing the same song as I do, right? And I think that it has to work like this. If you think about Medicare for all, what you're saying is you're part of all. You're going to get Medicare. Everybody that hears that, here's what's coming. Well, great, I'm going to get Medicare just like everybody else, right? I believe I once had an instructor in a particular course. I did this advocacy fellows leadership course. And what that trained people, basically what it trains you is working in the nonprofit world. How do you, it was actually trains you how to be an executive director of a nonprofit organization, but a lot of it was how do you advocate for that cause when you're the ED? And I'll never forget this. When you're trying to win people over, just remember this phrase. Everyone in America listens to the same radio station, WIIFM. What's in it for me? So if I was coming up with a phrase, Medicare for all, when you hear it, it tells you what's in it for them. I wouldn't come up with a phrase that says, hey, guess what? We're going to stop. We will no longer have, these corporations handling. What are you going to do? And what's in it for me? We're going to go with Medicare. And guess what? You're going to get it. And then you say, really? Well, what am I going to get? Okay, you're going to get this, 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 and this. So I would argue the phrase should say, when you hear what's in it for me, WIIFM, when somebody hears your phrase, it should say what's in it for them. It should advocate for something. It should scream out to them, you're going to get this. It could be a safer world. It could be a better life. It could be something, a safer community, whatever. But it should be something that's assertive and that says everybody's going to be better off with this. And I think, but to me, defund the police, that is just you. I mean, as far as, conservatives and libertarians and people who oppose, who don't want to admit that we still have systemic racism, it's like batting practice, and you're throwing the ball right down the middle of the plate. They could they could knock it right out of the park. That's why I think it's such an error. But remember something, and to add to it, in a conversation where the most important thing is what are we going to accomplish and how are we going to accomplish, we spend half the time arguing about the phrase itself. To me, that is a clear indicator it's the wrong phrase.
I'm going to play another clip from this video because they start to go into the abolition or the problem with the term with abolitionists. So I'm going to share my screen because this one really hit a button with me about what Ben Jealous says about abolitionists. Thanks so much, Justin, for the super chat. Reappropriate the police budget. So I think
I like it, but here's the
phrase.
problem. It's kind of like whatever. I'll remember it sooner or later. The first term that we had for single payer, that's the term we use. It's too technical. It's the technocratic term, right? It reappropriate, single payer, things of that nature. They sound kind of technical. It has to be like catchy, like the hook of a song. Simple, catchy, everybody hears it and everybody feels it. Wow. So what I would say is this: find a catchy term that means reappropriate the police budget. You know what I mean? Find a real sweet, pretty way to say that in a way that it just floats right off your lips and everybody hears it and they're like, oh yeah, that sounds great.
All right, I'm going to share my screen because I want to play this clip because they start to talk about abolitionists. Well, actually, Ben Jealous brings this up. And I was not too fond of what he said here about abolitionists. So here we go.
A whole solution.
But if people are so confused, why isn't there more narrative work being done to explain that defund the police does not mean, and abolitionists have never argued that it means we do lawlessness and just a libertarian gun show, every man for themselves, in the streets nonsense. That we're talking about the fact that police budgets have swelled over the course of the last decades with absolutely no correlation to a decrease in crime. And that people who are concerned about crime shouldn't be trying to address that concern by throwing more money at the police, that all that's doing is getting police driving military-style tanks through their neighborhood and absolutely no decrease in the social problems that they're identifying. And that if they want less crime in their neighborhoods, they should want to shift that funding from the police to anti-poverty measures, which are correlated with the rise of crime, right? Like that is the conversation we should be having.
Discipline, right?
Right, it is. But we endlessly have a conversation about whether or not defund the police is a good slogan, using a lot of words and oxygen and energy that could be telling those afraid older voters that defund is actually a safety mechanism. And funding the police does not make you safer.
Or we could just use a slogan that's literally not going to cut us off at the knees, which is what the civil rights community has had good discipline doing for like most of its hundreds of years. But, occasionally we make mistakes like any movement does. I would say this one is a mistake. And what we've done at People for the American Way, what our young elected officials have done, what our African-American Ministers Leadership Conference has done, is to actually go out there. And we did this in the midst of this because we were terrified by the impact. Mayor Savante Myrick, who's on our team, he replaced Andrew Gillum, who had been on People's Force staff for 17 years. All the time he was mayor, before he ran in city council, and before that, up until he ran for governor, has introduced a legislative package up in Ithaca, New York, And the reason you might say, oh, it's a little college town. The reason why college towns are so important is because when you're trying to transform criminal justice policy, college towns are where you want to start because they're the most comfortable with experimenting. So, for example, the Ban the Box movement, which I played a big part in while I was president of the NAACP, and when I was a foundation president before that, we started with college towns for that reason. Eventually, we had Walmart in the state of California, making it easier to employ formerly incarcerated people. But you've got to start somewhere. So the laboratory, when it's bottom up, it's college towns. And what do we put forward? We put forward that you have a public safety department, not a police department. That you have a civilian head, not a law enforcement head. That you have two divisions. One is, police officers. One is armed. The other one is social workers. And then over time, you replace about half of the police with social workers through attrition.
But that's just defund. That is defund.
That's a solution.
You don't have to call it
half an idea. It's half an idea.
It's not. But then there are.
I mean, come on, it's half an idea. Defund and what?
There are abolitionists who've been writing in detail for decades about what defunding the police actually looks like, and exactly what you're describing is what they're advocating for. But now, again, if you want to call it something else, I don't really care. I don't.
But you should care. Is my point.
No.
You should, just like you should care that Dr. King, right, said, let's put Rose Parks on the bus and not just take anybody who's having a problem on the bus.
Well, no. Here's the thing. I did not bring defund up in this conversation.
I know I did.
You did. So I am very happy moving through the world, avoiding subjects, avoiding language that I think is not going to work for my audience. What I do not do is use my platform to heap on antagonism to phrases that don't matter.
Family, right? This is a family podcast, right? This podcast, I can't imagine like as many, I don't know, Southern police chiefs listening to your podcast.
No, but there are a lot of libertarians that listen to this podcast. There are a lot of people across the political spectrum because they perceive me to be a fair dealer,
smart,
right?
incisive,
and the reality is,
which is why I'm here. And I'm just saying, let's be honest within the broad range of folks. Look, criminal justice, I've worked criminal justice reform with all those folks you've mentioned: libertarians, Christian conservatives, fiscal conservatives. In addition to from the left of the left of the left, right? And everybody with a hole for the moderates who tend to be addicted when they're in office to prison industrial complex money. So I don't mess with them on criminal justice reform because they will tie you up all day long. But all I'm saying is, when you want to abolish something, you got to be able to say defund and.
Well, the defund movie is doing that, and I hope that next time you are on TV and have the kind of platform that I am not afforded, and someone says defund is a bad slogan, you would suggest to them that poll numbers aren't telling the same story. Joe Biden also got his advocacy for fracking caused support for banning fracking to decline by 20 percentage points. Now, did fracking suddenly become a good idea because Joe Biden was like, fracking is good, and over the course of 4 or 5 months convinced an additional 20% of Americans that we had to frack? No. But people who are in respected positions of power, spending their time and energy maligning ideas, slogans, whatever it is, will affect poll numbers. And so I'm just unconscious of that, as well as I think I can be honest about the fact that, of course, there are some people who are going to be hesitant about defund. But my job as a communicator, I think, is not to poo-poo the idea or to say that it's not a well-thought-out idea, because it very much is. And the extreme slogan is abolish the police. Defund is the compromise. And Republicans...
That's a distinction without a difference. When you're, a working class Black grandmother at my church in Sandtown, they just simply want to know, well, what are you going to replace it with?
And then I would answer, and I would answer.
But it can't be long. It's got to be as short as defund the police.
You just sat here when you were explaining your program in Ithaca, used a lot of words to explain your version of. That's literally all you have to say.
So what we would say is half of modern police work is social work, and therefore half the department should be social workers.
And that's literally what these defund people are saying. And I have to believe that you know that.
They're talking like academics, not like organizers. I'm an organizer.
But they're not. There's plenty of organizers who are out there who have been doing this work for a really long time.
But what I'm saying is that if you're actually working as an organizer and you're focused on a solution, what you run into is you better start talking about your solution. And so defund the police And to me, an organizer is somebody who actually gets things. A lot of people who call themselves organizers who only lose, right?
Ben, come on.
No,
that is not fair.
Win, right. When you win, it is fair because there better be a high bar. There's a high bar for me as a young organizer, right? And so, and I want them to win. And I'm working with them every day, and we're actually got something passed that is now moved through. And we got unanimous support. And we got unanimous support by organizing Black folks and white folks and bombarding that city council with common sense. But we had to talk to them about what we were for. And so you can't just talk about what you're against. It's a real simple rhetorical point that you can talk about problem, you better talk about the solution too.
That's fine. And the Defund people, when given an opportunity to actually defend themselves on TV, instead of just having millionaires like Don Lemon sit around with their arms crossed, people who have never had to experience living in a crime-ridden environment, or to have as direct exposure to the kind of police surveillance and oppression that folks who, like myself and my siblings, grew up in New York.
No matter how rich they are, have to deal with police surveillance. I mean, let's not forget what Michael Bloomberg did.
Yeah, let's not forget what Michael Bloomberg did. Why don't you remind Don Lemon and the rest of them who were so quick to turn the tides? The point that you made earlier about this identity. Wait a minute. This point that you made earlier about the identity of interest between being told that white affluent liberals represent the interests of working class people. It's also a lot of Black affluent liberals who are told that they represent the interests of Black people. And I would argue too, there are a lot of people who are representing and providing cover for not just antagonism of certain political realities, but for entire political campaigns who paved the way for someone like Joe Biden to pay the way for Joe, juries are just doing their job. It's a great system, Biden, Jim Crow Joe, to be the obstructionist that he is being today. Hey, YouTube, thanks for watching.
Okay, so that clip was a little bit longer than I remember, but Garland, I want to get your take on Ben Jealous saying that it seemed like there wasn't a plan, like a next step, and because I know for me, I heard abolitionists talk about what after defunding the police, this is what we're going to do next. These are the next steps. But it seemed like he either didn't believe that or he just wasn't convinced by it. So what is your take on that about having something after defunding the police? And if you felt like that need was actually met?
And I think we're running into an issue right here. Because what you just said to me leaves me a bit confused. Because you said, okay, after defunding the police, then what next, right? And then I think to myself, when she says after defunding the police, and if I understand you correctly, defunding the police is a variety of things that you want to do, and which is take money and put it to some of the, and apply it, take lower law enforcement police budgets, and apply them to other areas that are the root causes of crime, and also change police departments so there's a law enforcement arm and there's an arm that addresses more like social workers. And so it's kind of it's a process, and it is fairly complicated, but it all makes sense, right? So if you're saying after doing all of that, what do we do next? Is that your question? After accomplishing all of those things, which is a pretty complicated process, what do we do next? Is that what you're asking?
Well, I know the answer to that because I have a list. I'm going to share my screen in a second. I know the answer to that, but it seemed like Ben Jealous didn't believe that there was an answer to that. So one part I did not play was earlier on. He said people need to stop calling themselves abolitionists because they haven't abolished anything. And so I felt like he was kind of just chomping down on organizers. And the way I kind of looked at it is though, instead of assuming that people didn't have a plan, why not talk to some of those activists and those abolitionists and ask them about the plan?
Right. And I got to get back to this. I think that there was an error in the movement for criminal justice reform. I'll just say that broadly. I worked on criminal justice reform, on police accountability, things like that. I think there is an error in the movement, and I think the movement is stumbling right now. And I think we are what we're doing right now is our conversation, and what I watch there is exposing it, because it's abolitionists, And then there's the discussion over who they are and what do they want and whether that's the right. Then there's defund the police. Well, is that the right term? And I think what we end up with is we can't get out of the gate, because the conversation is about what we're going to call ourselves, whether it's the right term. And then you end up never getting to the actual actions that you want to take because you're so busy. We're, not you, I'm saying that rhetorically. We are so busy quibbling over what we're going to call ourselves or whether we're using the right terms. I would argue we'd be better off to have no terms and just focus on what we want to do than constantly quibble over whether we're using the right terms. And then it's like it becomes a turf war. And now it's, well, and you've seen it. Well, we are the ADOS people. Oh, not the ADOS people. They're wrong. We're the, and your acronym is something else. No, we're the right people. And you never get to the meat of the issue. There are problems that Black folks have, and there are things we need to do to fix them. And if we can't get out of the gate because we're arguing about the terms that we use, we're not going to get anywhere. I would rather call ourselves nothing than argue over, I'll tell you what I don't understand. This is me. I don't understand the emotional attachment that people have to these phrases. Ultimately, my emotional attachment is to the betterment of people, downtrodden Black and brown folks, throughout the world. And I don't care if we call it, whatever. I don't care if we just call it a basketball. Whatever terms we use are not as important to me as what needs to be done. And if you think about it, the people who are suffering the most, they ain't worried about it. They just don't want to get shot, me being one of them. They just don't want to, go to court and not get a fair trial. They just don't want to see the police abuse their family members and then face no accountability, which means that more and more cops are going to do it because there's no accountability. And so are we helping the people who need help, which includes you and I both, obviously, if our conversation is always about I'm mad because you said abolitionists don't do this, and I'm not, to be quite frank, I'm not even sure. I'd have to ask you, who are abolitionists and what are they trying to abolish? Or are there different kinds of abolitionists that are trying to abolish different kind of abolitionists, different things that may or may not need to be abolished. But where am I then? I'm hung up and I can't get out of the starting gate. And my adversaries have ran halfway around the track because I'm sitting here arguing over, whether or not I'm using the right terms. That's part of what I believe and what I see here.
So I wish, this is one of those things, I wish I could just send this to Ben Jealous, because I'm going to share my screen here, because when people say there wasn't a plan, I just want to show this to everyone, especially if you haven't seen this in the chat. So my comrade Nick from Revolutionary Blackout co-founded 10 Demands with Awkward. And a lot of you may be familiar with Awkward as a musician. He was on my show many, many months ago, back in the beginning when I started my podcast, actually. And he broke down 10 Demands. And so I'm not going to go through all the details, but I do want to let you know, this is what they had in mind. Defund the police and reallocate resources to impacted communities. That's one demand. And then if you click on the drop down here, it goes into detail. The second is demilitarize the police. Third is eliminate discriminatory policing, prosecution, and sentencing. 4, institute complete law enforcement transparency and accountability. 5, independently investigate all police crimes and abuses of power. 6, install community representation, oversight, and safety measures. 7, end strategic counter-protest violence. 8, apologize and provide reparations. And that is very important here. I want to point that out. 9, end the war on drugs. And 10, end carceral punishment. Now that is from the 10 Demands team. You have Anna, Awkward, Cheyenne, Jen, Nick, Patrona, and Zoya. These are activists and abolitionists who came up with this on their own. And my question is how do we get this information out to more people? And this is one of the things when I saw mainstream media having these talking points about defund the police, Don Lemon was a big one. He was like, this is a bad idea and Democrats are losing because of it. It's just that they are not going to tell their audience this information. They're not going to show them, hey, there's activists out there who actually do have a plan. And so, Garland, I have to get your opinion about this. You were a former police officer. From your experience, do you think that police can be reformed?
Oh, yes, I do. I think, but you know what? I believe that in America, we need to do something different. And I believe in, for instance, I like the term public. I think we need to get away from the term police. I like the term public safety. I think we need to act because public safety, think about this. Policing is in itself means you have to control, right? You're going to put the term police. You're talking about the term control. I remember the first time I ever heard the term police that I can remember as a little kid, I was in Boy Scouts. And we were at our camp and they said, police the area. And I'm like, what does that mean? That means clean up all the trash and throw it in the witch. And that's a term they use in the military. I'm like, oh, okay, police the area, clean up everything. And so you're cleaning up everything. You're in control of everything. I think public safety, instead of police departments, they should be public safety departments, because now that implies that this organization, whatever it is there for the service of the public, which it should be, and it's there for the safety, not to shoot or beat or mangle the public, which is what policing kind of ends up doing. It's to serve the public and to make them happier and healthier. So I'm for one thing, I think it should go to public safety. We should move to public safety departments, not police departments. And then a public safety department can now have all types of things. Well, certainly you got to have an investigations division. I mean, let's face it, if there's a murder, you want somebody to figure out who the murderer was, right? But a public safety department, if you have, let me add this, just an example of investigations of a person who was a former chief of investigations division. What you don't want in this investigation is to grab some poor kid in there, put him in a room with a light in his face, and have people harass him until he admits to doing something that he didn't do. If you're going to bring people in during an investigation, there should be somebody there. Of course, they should be able to have their lawyer, but there should be somebody there to ensure that that doesn't happen. There should be rules. There should be a non-law enforcement observer there who looks at it and makes sure that they don't, pound somebody, mentally and emotionally pound somebody until they, admit that they did something that they didn't do, which actually happens. So a public safety department will be much broader. And I think that's a positive term that can be used. Although, and I'll say this again, I got to keep getting back to it. Rhetoric is important because just kind of going back to the Rorschach blog, what's the first word that comes to the mind? When I saw number one, defund the police, blah, blah, blah. And number two said, and we're going to do this with the police. My mind instantly did this without trying. Well, wait a minute. If we defunded the police in section 1, then when we get to section 2 and we're going to do this and this and this to the police, well, they ain't there no more. So we defunded them. So we can't do anything else to the police because they're non-existent. I'm not saying that I didn't know what Nick was saying and the group was saying. I'm saying that the way my mind worked, it clicked that way automatically. And I'm on your side. So if you're selling this to, forget the people that disagree with you, conservative to whoever, who are going to oppose it as a matter of ideology, to people who are kind of sitting out there thinking, okay, I'm open, I want to hear what you have to say. And you're saying things that automatically seem to contradict each other. We're going to defund the police. Great. And then we're going to do this to the police. And my brain goes, well, didn't we just defund them? Then how can we do anything to them? Because they're gone. They got no money. They got no cars. They got no money for salary. They have disappeared. And now we're going to do something to this group that doesn't exist anymore. There was like a contradiction in my brain that I was trying to grasp a hold of. And if I'm doing it and I'm on your side, the people that ain't on your side are, and the people who are potential allies are going to do the same thing. And I think you're making it harder for yourself. Again, I get back to that. As I said, I'm on your side and I agree with everything. Most of the things that I probably don't agree with everything. Nobody agrees with everything. But most of the stuff you're saying, probably 95% of it, I would probably agree with it.
So I do just want to say in reference to like reform, like I think this is where we may differ because I personally don't think the police can be reformed. And the reason why I think that is because number one, we've had police reforms in the past, like body cams was a smaller part of police reform. And I see all these videos where police officers just turn the body cams off. So I feel like we've tried police reform, and I feel like the reason why it doesn't work is because of the system. It's not the individual officers, it's the police state. And by that, what I mean is the fact that, the fact that an officer can just turn his body cam off. The reason why he feels that he can do that is because we still have qualified immunity. The reason why we have police brutality is because we still have qualified immunity. So there's no accountability there. So if you work for an employer where there's no accountability and you can get away with doing these things, there's not as much of an urge to always do the right thing. So I feel like for me, I think you have to tear the system down and you have to rebuild a new one. And for me, what that would look like is, number one, I would not have police officers handle any mental health situations because I've seen those in person just go terribly wrong. They're not trained to deal with that. There are people who are. There are people who are trained to deal with that. And I feel like those are the people who should go out in the community. I don't feel that police officers should make traffic stops, because I've also seen those go terribly wrong. And it's just like, I feel like we put police in situations in this country where we don't really need them there. So that's one part of it. And then the other part that I wanted to say is that I think that people sometimes mix up defund with abolish. Defunding the police doesn't get rid of the police. Abolishing the police does get rid of the police. And I think that defund is like the first step to get to the path to abolishing the police. Now, people come in and say, well, what do we do if we don't have cops? And one of the things that Ben Jealous brought up about Baltimore, my parents are from Baltimore. Baltimore does have high crime. And he talked about people being scared. The old people in the church are scared if you defund the police. But why is that? Why is the crime so high? And a lot of times it's linked back to poverty. So I feel like in order for this to truly work, you really have to fix the poverty situation that we have in this country.
Oh, I'm 100% with you, but I guess where we disagree, disagree because I'm such a literal person. The term defund, to stop the flow of funds to. So from a literal perspective, from the actual definition, defund the police does get rid of the police. From the actual literal definition, if you stop the flow of funds to the Department of Education, there's no funds coming to the Department of Education, you no longer have the Department of Education. So, and I think that gets into the problem that I have with the phrase. But I'm with you, it can be kind of, I'm with you most everything you said. And it can get kind of a fatalistic feeling at times when you realize that, you're talking about an issue where racism is in the DNA of America. Think about this. I'll never forget. Let me tell you a story real quick. I was a young man and I went out and bought a shiny new car, and it was a foreign car. It was a nice car. I was a police officer at the time. I used to go in 7-Eleven every day and get a cup of coffee. So one day I walked in, there was a BMW. I had a BMW. Like 92, 93, 94 in that range. So I go in with my shiny BMW. I go in 7-Eleven. The people see me there every day, and there's a bunch of people in the area I live is mostly white. I walk out, I get in the car. The next day I come in and the guy in there's laughing. He says, guess what happened? I said, what? He says, when you went out yesterday, he said, there was a bunch of white people in there. And they said, well, we know how he got that car. And he said, how? And they said, he's a drug dealer. And the guy said, well, no, he's a cop. I know him. He comes in every day. And they just went, oh, they weren't cops. But in the same way that when I ride down the road, and I could tell you time after time, and I was a cop that I faced being pulled over because I was a black person in a shiny car, in a nice car, whatever the case might be, that I was profiled, all of those kind of things, that I was mistreated because of my race by police officers, and I was a cop. Those people, if they work, the only difference between them and the cops were they didn't have a gun and badge on. And if they did, they'd have been like, there's a drug dealer. So the reality is this, it's not just about like a person becomes a cop and magically they think differently than the rest of the world, that somehow outside of that, all of the regular people are, no. This is part of what we're dealing with in America. And what we have to do is find a way that when an American comes in to law enforcement, that we mitigate the racism that's coming into law enforcement from America. I had another time, me and some buddies of mine, all three of us law enforcement officers, we're sitting in this parking lot, and we're just like eating a sandwich, drinking a soda at the time. And we see a state trooper, Maryland state trooper, black dude. He goes driving. I mean, there's cars, there's people. It's in the stuff. They're eating sandwiches, doing whatever. He drives past all the cars. He comes up. He pulls beside my car. The car, I was in the passenger seat beside the car, and I thought he had something to say. He obviously didn't know we were cops. All had on ties, suits. We were going somewhere. I put the window down, and he looks. He goes, "So what are you guys doing, hanging around here?" Anyway, I put the window up. I put the window up because I know the law, right? And he looked for a second, and then he just pulled away. And I knew it was, oh, hey, there's black folks here. And it was black. He was black. That's that's what America brings into law enforcement. So it's like when it's not like, hey, cops come to law enforcement and suddenly they become racist. This is America. And when they're in law enforcement, you have to mitigate the racism of America. That's what makes it so difficult. When people go to court, and the jury, they ain't cops. They're not part of the system. They're just plain old people. And guess what happens with these juries? They're more likely to convict black folks or brown folks than they are white folks. Right. So what we're looking at is, how do we have a public safety? Not how do we just clean up law enforcement? How do we have a public safety system that literally mitigates the racism that's coming into it from America? I think that's something that we have to take into account. People get mixed up and they're like, well, people are just walking the street and they're perfectly fine. And then they become a cop and they turn into a racist then. And I guess when they retire, they're no longer a racist. I only wish that were the problem. Because then the old bad apples thing would work. It's just in bad individuals. There's not a problem with the whole orchard. The orchard is bad. And the law enforcement is one tree in the orchard. How do you mitigate the racism that's coming into that tree from a bad orchard? I think I'm getting carried away with the metaphor. Sorry about that, but you get my point.
Thanks so much, Alan C., for the super chat. The conversation about the phrase is irrelevant. Ben Jealous brought up defund because he was trying to move the conversation to a topic he could be right on. We need community policing. Qualified immunity won't go away. Thank you so much for the super chat, Alan. Really appreciate that. In reference to community policing, what is your opinion of that? Because the only thing I worry about is that certain people are going to be targeted more than others. Like, I'm thinking back to George Zimmerman. I'm thinking back to, recently Ahmaud Arbery. I felt like that was kind of the men who chased down Ahmaud Arbery said they did so under Georgia's citizen arrest law. That's the only thing I worry about with community policing, is that certain people are going to be targeted more than others, especially depending on what neighborhood you're in.
So community policing, actually, the definition of community policing, what is it supposed to be? Community policing is supposed to be that instead of law enforcement officers driving around in a car with the windows up and being separate from the community and only getting out when, there's a call, community policing is supposed to be that the officers go walk around the community and they talk to people and they interact with the community and they're part of the community. That's actually technically what community policing is supposed to be. And by definition, there are various errors of law enforcement, and the error we are in is considered the community policing error, right? In reality, it means nothing. To me, community policing means nothing. The idea that does nothing to address the problems. So the cops are wandering around. So they're going in and out of the local stores and they're talking to people, et cetera, et cetera. That doesn't, I'll put it like this. I have yet to see the so-called enactment of community policing or any police departments do anything to change or mitigate the problems that Black and brown people have when it comes to being overly policed when it comes to, suffering from violence at the hands of police, and when it comes from having their constitutional rights constantly and consistently violated.
Was there ever a time, as I'm curious, you are the first former police officer I've talked to, like on here. But I'm curious, as a Black police officer, were there ever times when you felt like, let's say, some of the racial situations that have happened, was there ever a time when you kind of felt conflicted?
In what way?
In reference to, let's say the Black Lives Matter protests. And I don't know how long ago you were an officer, but
yeah, it was before that. I retired in like 2008, so they weren't going on when I retired. I retired, fairly young.
Gotcha. There was a picture that was going around on social media, and it was of a Black police officer in DC, and he was lined up with the other police officers, and the protesters were there, and there was a Black protester standing in front of him, and he maced him. The protester wasn't violent or anything, but at that point in time, the police were doing that. They were macing pepper spraying the protesters that were standing there in the street. And the message that was kind of going around was, how does the Black police officer feel in that situation? Because at one point, on one hand, you have to do your job because you're a cop. At the same time, you're looking at people that look like you who are fighting against injustice. And it's almost like because of your job, you can't be on that side with them, even if you may agree with them.
So let me be as frank as possible here. I never, I wasn't involved much in protesting. I rose up the ranks fairly quickly, so I wasn't on the street a lot. But I'll say this, to be quite frank. I'll put it like this. When I was a cop, weed was illegal. And did I see some Black folks with weed? Plenty. Did I arrest any of them? None. Not one person. You will never find, you can search the earth, and you will never find a person who says Garland Nixon arrested me for weed or anything like that. Didn't do it. So I tended to be very lenient when it came to Black folks as a law enforcement, extremely lenient when it came to Black folks. But I'll be honest with you, I wrote a lot of warnings anyway. I was not an over-policing person. I wrote a lot of warnings. I wrote very few tickets. And so I wasn't, the aggressive police officer anyway. I was more the cerebral kind of person. I like to talk to people. I like to figure out what was going on. But yeah, so when it came to people who I dealt with, I wasn't a hammer down person. And as an example, I remember when I was a regional commander, and I had a guy who, and all of the investigation reports would come into me, right? And one day I looked at an investigative report, and I called the officer in, and basically what happened was he had told the guy was sitting on the bench, and he told the guy, "You've got to leave." And the guy basically said, "Why the F do I have to leave? You got to leave because I said you got to leave and I'm a law enforcement officer." The guy said, "No," he arrested him. I called him in my office and I said, "Why the F did he have to leave?" And he said, "Well, because I'm a police officer and I was taking control and I had to tell him, and he had to follow a lawful order." I said, "What was lawful about the order?" And he couldn't tell me. I said, "You're right." I said, "Here's what you're going to do. You're going to go to the state's attorney. You're going to null pros that case, and you better hope that he doesn't sue you, because I'm going to have to testify on your behalf." So when I was there, look, I stood for what I stood for, and so from my perspective, I wasn't the guy that was Mason. I was not going to do it. And if I saw somebody else do it, I would have wrote up a report and said that's wrong. I've always been like that. I have passed up and walked away from a whole lot of money in my life in the journalism world simply because I couldn't go along with things that I didn't believe. I was on Fox News for years arguing with the conservatives. I was doing TV. I walked away from television because of what I believed in. So the idea that, to me, you have to have principles. You have to stand for something. You have to stand for what you believe in. And that's, look, very recently, 2 months ago, I was on the National Board of Directors for the American Civil Liberties Union. It was great. I loved it. Who doesn't want to be on the national board of some company, organization that brings in 300 million a year. Yeah, you fly around, you stay in first, 5-star hotels, you talk with powerful people, you make decisions. It's fun, it's enjoyable, and you feel like you're accomplishing something. But they wrote an op-ed in the New York Times in favor of vaccine mandates, and I felt, when I look at the numbers in New York City, it's going to disproportionately hurt young Black folks. I resigned in protest. I sent them a letter that said, do not associate my name with this organization anymore, because I felt these are my people. And I feel like some people may or may not agree with me, but I felt, in my opinion, I had to stand up for my people, and I walked away from it. So I've always been a person. I mean, I'm not here to blow my own horn. I'm here to say everybody should be like that. You have to have some principles. One of these days, you're going to lay down in this ground, and it ain't going to matter anyway. So you have to stand for what you believe in. And that's all I've ever done.
I have one more question for you.
Sure.
So I told you my parents grew up in Baltimore. I have
Mhm.
spent time in Baltimore when I was younger. And one of the things that I noticed is that police officers in Baltimore City, they would cruise around blocks, and almost like they were looking for trouble. They're just looking to try to find somebody to target or to arrest. And one of the things that I noticed is that all the police officers that were doing that, they were white police officers. In your opinion, do you feel that when it comes to policing communities, should there be a presence of more Black police officers in general? Should there be a presence of Black police officers in Black communities? Or do you think that the racial component doesn't matter?
I do think it matters. And I do think that there should be a consideration for that. And I'm going to tell you, because, I grew up just outside of Baltimore, spent a lot of my younger years in Baltimore, hanging around Baltimore, partying in Baltimore. My cousin, I used to stay at this house in West Baltimore. So I know a lot about Baltimore City. And Baltimore City policing was horrific. You don't have enough time for me to tell you the stories that I've seen of abuse in Baltimore City police. And in all but one instance, to be honest, the abuse that I saw against Black folks were white officers. I did run into one instance where I was dealing with a Black cop, and he just started acting like an idiot. He didn't hit me or anything, but he started yelling and acting like a fool. And at the time I was like, what's wrong with this idiot? But I put it like this. He acted like a fool, but he didn't get physical or anything like this. But I've seen a lot of white officers that were, man, they were bad news. I was threatening people, using violence. I mean, just everything that law enforcement should not be. They acted like an occupying force. They acted like they could do anything they wanted to Black folks with impunity, which they could. So yeah, Baltimore City Police was terrible, and it horrifies me to think that it's not just Baltimore City. And I just watched them, guys that would just beat people. I mean, and I'm saying not as a law enforcement officer. I'm saying when I was a young man growing up in the city, around the city, hanging out there, or being there with relatives or whatever, the stories that I heard, of like people literally saying to me, yeah, I knew one guy who, he went to one part of the city. He worked for this wealthy Jewish guy in a wealthy part of the city. And when he would come home, he had to walk up the corner in this wealthy area and wait at the bus stop. And so here's a Black guy in this wealthy white/Jewish area waiting at the bus stop, and the cops would come over. And the cop actually came over one time, punched him in the stomach just because he was there, and would come up there. They'd stop. What are you doing here? Hey, I'm catching the bus to go home. I work for Mr. So-and-so. And so it was like some kind of a Driving Miss Daisy movie where, he was completely and absolutely mistreated purely because of his race, because he was in a white area, and because they could get away with it. Yeah, Baltimore City Police was abysmal, and it horrifies me to think that that's what was going on all over this nation, but I kind of believe that it was.
Absolutely. Garland, thanks so much for coming on. This has been a great discussion. I do want to read this chat from Roger Meadows on Rockfin. Thanks for the tip, Roger Meadows. That seemed like a lot of wasted energy and time talking about a GD slogan. The good thing about the slogan is it causes us to speak about how to reform policing. We have a New York State bill to end qualified immunity by New York Senator Robert Jackson. The bill is S1991, and Assemblywoman Pamela Hunter, A4331. Let's support that bill. NYC abolished it little over a year ago. This bill would do it statewide. Cops would think twice. Thanks so much for the tip on Rockfin, Roger Meadows. Thanks so much for coming.
Might I say one other quick thing? I can make it quick.
Mhm.
Here's something, if people said one thing that needs to be changed that could make a difference immediately, this is it. Law enforcement agencies cannot be allowed to investigate themselves when it comes to brutality or any use of force. It has to go outside of the departments. I was in charge of the investigations. How in the world are you going to have some guy and some police officer investigating another guy and they're both in a bowling league on Thursday night? That ain't never gonna. So the first one of the things that absolutely needs to be happened is investigations of law enforcement for violence or brutality has to be outside of the police department. It can't be in the prosecutor's office or the state's attorney's office because they work with the cops, and they can't hire retired cops to do it. It has to be outside of that system completely. So cops are no longer, law enforcement officers are no longer investigating themselves. It is absurd to think that a police department can investigate its own department for any type of violence, and you're going to have an unbiased investigation. That's like the number one thing that should happen immediately.
Well said. Thanks so much for coming on, Garland. Before you go, where can people find you?
Twitter at Garland Nixon, Garland .Nixon on Instagram, just plain old Garland Nixon on Facebook. I'm on WPFW 89.3 FM every Friday, 6 to 7, KPFK in Los Angeles every Monday from 2 to 3 Pacific.
Awesome.
And GarlandN at gmail.com. GarlandN, my first name and my first letter of my last name at gmail.com. I always give it out. Feel free to email me.
Oh, be careful with that one, Garland.
Oh, I don't mind. I'm like a hyper and OCD. I'll read every single one of them.
Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
All right, guys, you know how we do this. Have a good night. Keep up the fight.